This is the second video in a series for power tools for the beginning woodworker and do-it-yourselfer for less than $1,200. In the previous video, I covered measuring and marking, cutting, and joining. In this video, I'm going to be continuing that series and covering drilling, milling, squaring, and flattening, shaping edges, sanding, clamping, sharpening, work surface workbench, and safety. Thanks. Okay, so the next subject, the next area is drilling. And these are the kinds of tools that I'm going to recommend you get for drilling. I don't believe you need a drill press to start off with. I think that it's easier just to learn how to drill straight with these, not at an angle, not up and down. And I think those can be learned just by doing that on a repeated basis. I think it's more important to talk about the kinds of drill bits that you need. These are normal twist drill bits. This just happens to be a master mechanic set. It's a whole big set of everything you need from, 1/16 all the way up to, I think, what is it, 1/2 inch or even longer, even wider. Anyway, they're just twist drill bits, just like this. They are good for drilling holes, except in metal, plastics, and wood. But what happens is they will tend to wander, especially for bigger bit sizes. And there are two ways to solve that problem. One is with brad point bits. Brad point bits, if you look just right at the tip there, you can see it's got a little bit of a point. That point is very helpful when you're trying to cut into wood. Especially if it's at any angle, you can start it and drill it at that angle. A brad point bit will hold that starting spot and drill straight in. What I find them not useful for is if I'm joining a couple of boards together and I'm putting a dowel to join those boards together like this, and I'm drilling all the way through. This bit will make a rounder hole, more of an oblong hole, a larger hole in this piece of wood as I drill into this piece of wood. One of the ways to avoid that is to use another bit, and that's called a Forstner bit. And a Forstner bit, as you can see, only has the drilling portion of it right at the end, so that if I went into this wood and got to this point, it wouldn't be rounding this piece of wood as I went in there. It leaves a nice clean hole. An example of that clean hole is shown here. Those are beautiful little 3/8 holes that I used a 3/8 inch bit to cut with a Forstner bit. So they're very handy. The last category is countersinking. Drilling and countersinking for a screw all at the same time. And these are very handy. They're you can put different size small bits in. What you do is lock them in place. I'm just releasing that and putting it back in, and then locking it to the depth that I need, which is important for the length of the screw. So these are the kinds of things that I recommend you get if you're just starting out. You don't need a full set, but you need some of these pieces of equipment. I'll show you the drill press that I have over here, and that's a very simple one. I've used this for ages. It's fine, and it certainly cuts at a 90-degree angle or however angle I set this at. So that's useful, but it's not necessary to start off with. All right, so milling, squaring, and flattening. What do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is what you typically do with boards if you buy them rough sawn. And rough sawn lumber as opposed to boards that are milled smooth is shown up here, Alex. I don't have a board that I can pull down. I don't want to pull these out of the overhead. But both of these, if you look at the grain, and if you turn around and aim this way, Alex, you can see that grain and back up a little bit. You can see that grain right in there. See all that? That's all rough sawn. That's right off the sawmill, coming from the sawmill. And what you do is you get wood that is sized. Let's say you get 4/4, that's a little bit over an inch thick, and then you plane it down with a planer to smooth the surface, and you get it to either 13/16 or 3/4 of an inch. And you do that on devices like this. This happens to be a DeWalt planer. I've used this for a number of years. It's not the big industrial one, but it's adequate for boards that are, say, 6 to 8 to 10 inches in width. And you can run them through, and I've done that for quite a bit of my use. But I'm going to tell you that that's not a device you need when you're starting out woodworking. And why? Well, because you can buy surfaced lumber. It's called S4S. S4S, surfaced 4 sides. What does that mean? That means it's planed on this side. It means it's planed on this side, and this side, and they're all square. If you just get a little square like this, you can see that they're square all the way around, and that's the whole idea. Now, you pay more for this kind of lumber per unit lumber price, per unit piece of lumber, but you didn't spend the money to start off with on an expensive planer, surface planer, or joiner. Joiners are used typically to get this edge square to this face. Planers are used to get this surface parallel to this surface. And it's really not necessary to have either one. S4S, you will save considerable amount of money, and you can get that kind of wood at several places. Big box stores, including Home Depot, Lowe's, places like that. If you go to lumber yards that give rough sawn wood, some of those lumber yards will surface the wood for you at an additional charge. You can also get them at Rockler's or Home Crafts, or Wood Crafts rather. Then that's another alternative. A third alternative is to go to a place like we have in Portland, Maine. It's called the Open Bench Project. The Open Bench Project has industrial equipment for both joining and planing. And I've used that several times. If you just turn around and focus over here at all my wood supply, I just tried to find a rough caught piece of wood in this pile, and I could. I've got cherry, I've got poplar, I've got walnut, and I've got several different types of figured maple. Okay, so this section is called shaping, or shaping edges. And I've made this section just because it's different than cutting dados. It's different than using tools to sculpt wood. It's just typically working on the edges of the wood. And what I mean by that is a lot of times you'll just have a need to round over an edge like this to make it smooth rather than sharp. There's a bit in here that's used for that purpose. I've got this unplugged or I wouldn't be touching the blade. There are many such roundover bits. Here's an example of one. You can see that just rounds the piece of wood as it spins at high speed, and it's got a little device on the top with a bearing in it so that will rest against the wood when you go against it, so you can get a nice shape, the shape that you want. Roundover bits aren't the only bits, but those are examples of different cuts that you can make. I have cuts that are router bits that make triangular cuts at 45. I've got trim bits that go against an edge. There's, literally hundreds of different kinds of bits that you can use, and different sizes, different portions of the bit that chucks in place from that size down to this size. Okay, so this segment is called sanding, and I have two devices that I use, and one is this bench-mounted belt sander, and this is a very useful device if I have a piece of a glue up like this, where I have irregularities in the surface and there's glue on it, and I can use that to take that down and sand that very flat. The nice thing is I can control, because I've gotten used to it, exactly how that sands off without making gouges in the wood. It removes the initial rough portion of the wood. So that's an example of the use of that sander. I typically have 80 grit on here because that's what I use it for, something to really bring down the surface of the wood or make it smooth quite quickly. Then what I do is I go over here and I have one of the most important tools in my shop, a random orbital sander. This happens to be made by Makita. There are a number of good ones on the market. What does random and orbital mean? Well, it means that when you sand something that has marks on it, it will remove those marks depending on the grit, but it also won't leave a trail of sand marks so that the wood becomes perfectly smooth. I typically start off with something like 60 grit and then go right down to 220 grit. These holes in the piece of sandpaper are very useful because it pulls the dust away and it gets a good portion of it if you get a good one. I then hand sand down to 400 grit with paper like this if I'm between coats and varnishing or oil and varnish finishing. So that's what I use. And I just switch these discs back and forth. They're just Velcroed on. It's a very easy process. And I would use that immediately after I went with the belt sander on this particular piece of wood. Here's an example of a tool that I don't use. And I don't use it because it's too, it removes wood too rapidly. And if you're not very careful with it and use it on tabletops, for example, what you will do is leave gouges in the tabletop as opposed to accomplishing what you want. You can use them skillfully, but I find it's easier if I'm doing tabletops to align the boards better to start off with. So that's it on sanding. Okay, next subject is clamping. And there's a statement that you can't have enough clamps, but I think the more important thing is you have to have the right clamps for the task at hand. So let's focus over here, Alex, on this beginning of a tabletop. So what we have is 3 boards that are put together, and this is a typical style of clamping for those 3 boards. What I do way before I put glue on the boards is I put all the boards together. I match the grain as much as I can. I make sure that the edges are good and that when I clamp it together, I only have minor irregularities up and down so that I don't have to do too much sanding. Now there's a couple of problems that I noticed right off when doing this, but before I get to that, let's just talk about what we're doing with the clamps. This is edge clamping or edge gluing, and we're putting the edges of the board together, and we refer to the edges as this particular surface, this is the face, and this is the end grain. So the edges needed to be clamped together, and on a typical table I might have one more board on this. This happens to be about 60 inches long, a typical length of a table. And so the whole idea is to use, I like to use these pipe clamps and a very good clamping surface. What do I mean by that? Well, you can do this on a workbench, or even better, I do it on this clamping surface. And what do I mean by that? This happens to be a wooden door encased in metal that is absolutely flat, so that if I put these clamps down on that surface, it's going to support these boards a uniform distance above the surface, and again, flat. Now, what happens with the boards that you select is, again, you don't want boards with a lot of twist or cupping or bending in them, and these boards have all been surfaced to the same thickness, and you've got to do that way before you even think about putting them together. That's been done with these boards, and then you typically clamp the edges where the boards come together if there's any irregularities, and you start in one end and you feel the joints, and then you tighten this clamp and you move to the next one and you tighten this clamp, or you add a clamp if that's necessary. You're working your way all along this whole surface, clamping it together, again, before you applied glue, just to see whether or not there's enough good fit up. And I would say that this set of boards is not quite ready to be glued together. Why? Focus on this little line here. That's not a good enough joint, okay? I would have to go back and either plane this joint or run it to the table saw to make it a suitable joint. I have a device that I use, which is a piece of ash that I have marked as to a surface that is absolutely perfectly flat. And I use that all the time when I'm building a table saw or a table like this. So I get it just the way I want. So you can see I've used basically two kinds of clamps, these little pistol grip clamps, as well as pipe clamps. They're both very useful for that purpose. So those are the elements: a flat surface, a uniform set of clamps, a way to clamp the ends of the boards if you need to, and then moving through the whole thing to make sure, the whole surface, to make sure you've got what you need. That does not mean that you're going to end up with a perfectly flat surface. There's a spot over in here that is maybe 3/1000ths too high, and I would just sand that down. That's fine. But this is not suitably adequate, so I would go back and rework that board. I'm just giving you an idea of how you go about this process. One of the next methods that you use is clamping the faces of boards, two faces like this together. And typically you use these F-style clamps for that purpose. Put as many on there as you need, and that's very useful. All right, so edge banding. Edge banding is a process like you see on this drawer, Alex. This is banded with, because this is plywood, this is banded with a piece of cherry right on the edge. And if you have a clamp like this, they're bandy clamps that have a rubber that goes from here all the way around like that to the other side. And you slip those on and they push the particular face banding down. They're very useful for that purpose. So the other thing is clamping fixtures to the table. You come into a situation where you need your fixtures either clamped onto the table. Let's say you're doing pocket hole screws and you're going to clamp that down. There's a variety of clamps, and if you focus up here, Alex, you can see all the different kinds of clamps that I've come to use over in here and here over the period of time. One more type of clamp that is useful, and that is for making cabinets, and this happens to be one that you can join the cabinets, and this surface is perfectly 90 degrees to that. I have several of those when I'm making cabinetry. So, toggle clamps, face clamping, F clamps, all kinds of clamps for different purposes, and that's all prior to glue up. So that's it, unclamping. Okay, so the next topic is sharpening, and it's a topic that I don't believe enough attention is paid to for it, especially if you're a beginning woodworker. You should be aware of the fact that certain tools just need to be sharpened on a regular basis. And so I'm going to talk about what I sharpen myself and what I have taken out for sharpening. On my chop saw or my compound miter saw, as well as taper saw, I have a 10-inch blade. And this is an example of one that was sharpened back in July 2020. And I sent this out to be sharpened because getting all these teeth just perfectly sharpened and at the right height and at the right angle takes equipment that I simply don't have in the shop, and I have no intention of ever buying it. But I do think it's important to sharpen those blades every once in a while. And when do you notice when things aren't sharpened? Well, if you're on a table saw, you may notice the wood burning. You may have to push harder to get the workpiece through the table saw. It may vibrate. There might be a variety of different things that you can use to tell whether or not something is sharp. But one of the tools that you can use is your fingers. Your fingers talk to you in ways that let you know. If you feel an edge and it feels dull, like this one feels a little dull to me right now, I know that that needs to be sharpened, okay? And there are ways to do that. So what I do is I sharpen my Fastener blades, I sharpen my router blades, I sharpen my chisels, I sharpen my plane irons in planes, and I have different tools for the hand tools than I do for the power tools. But basically for the hand tools, I have a jig which indicates the angle that I sharpen various chisels or plane irons for, and I set that up, and then I move it back and forth with this little honing guide on top of a diamond plate, and these are of various grit, and then hone it on a leather strope and make it as sharp as I need to. I'm not going to go into a lot more detail on that, but this little kit, which is from Trend Diamond Sharpening Solutions, has two things that are very useful for your router bits or for your Forstner bits. And this is a little handheld device that is diamond based. It's flat on one side, it's rounded on the other side, and the way that you use it is by getting the flat side on this edge. You don't want to cut on the outside edge at all because that's the exact diameter of this bit. But you do want to sharpen this edge, and you do want to sharpen this little edge right in here. So you do that just by going back and forth on that surface until you get it sharp. It doesn't take very many pulls back and forth. The same process can be used on this router bit, and if I can get that router bit sharpened just by moving it back and forth like this right on top of that surface. I use their fluid, their lapping fluid, just because that's the best fluid that can be used to wash away the swarf, the leftover pieces of steel that you grind off with these little diamond plates. So, like I say, sharpening is very important and should be in the arsenal of every woodworker, including beginning woodworkers. And I think it's something that you can read a lot more about, you can study about, and you can choose your methods, but don't forget the process of sharpening. Thank you. the last task, the last major thing that we need to talk about is a working surface, either a flat tabletop or a workbench. And we talked early in this video about the delightfulness or the necessity to have a very flat surface. I've talked about this metal door, and it's wood on the inside and metal on the outside, made perfectly flat. You can see on the top that it's a perfect surface to use to lay a table down, and it's just supported by sawhorses underneath, but they're all leveled out so that becomes a great place to do glue ups and to lay out projects that require a big flat surface that don't require clamping down to the surface. So I recommend something like this for the beginning woodworker, because you don't yet have the skills to build perhaps the workbench that you wish to have. But I will mention to you that I put together a prior video on putting together a workbench like this for less than $200, a little over $200 with this screw clamping mechanism. But a workbench is one big flat surface with all kinds of clamping ability. You have hold downs that hold wood that go into the board and are used to hold down wood like this, so you can work on it. They lock it in place. You have devices like this that can be used between boards, and then you clamp them in place so you can work on them. You have all kinds of jigs and fixtures that allow you to take a light like this and move it where you want it. You have clamping devices that I've made that I slide down in here and tighten up with screws so they lock in place. Push this against it and adjust that screw to clamp something in place. Of course, you can use your clamps on the workbench itself if you have to lock something down, because you can clamp that to the outside of the table. So those are the two things. This, you can get a rather inexpensive one, or wait until you can make one, or buy one if you can afford a really good workbench. The choice is yours, but those two, the working surface and the workbench, you're going to end up with probably as a more experienced woodworker. Thanks. Okay, so safety, personal safety. We've talked about table saw safety. We've talked in other areas about watching moving equipment and that safety, but now I want to talk about other aspects of safety, and that's your own personal safety. One is your hearing. These particular devices go over your ears, and they are very, very useful to block out noise, because when I've got the table saw running and various devices for pulling in dust, there's a lot of noise in the workshop. The next thing is, this is from Trend Technology. This is an air stealth mask. Again, this is primarily for dust protection. And I use this all the time. I have used it less in my shop because I've spent a lot of time eliminating the amount of dust that I've generated. But anyway, you put it on like that, and you significantly remove the dust that you breathe in. Very important, because your lungs really don't like an environment like this. Another one is put out by 3M. Now this is for the fumes that you can have in a workshop when you're doing a lot of finishing with different kinds of chemicals. Again, very important. Please read the instructions on the cans and determine if you need to have this while you're doing those tasks. Very important to have this kind of equipment for your own personal safety. So thank you very much. So this is the list that you've been waiting for, the recommended power tools for woodworkers or do-it-yourselfers for less than $1,200. So I've put together items on this list in addition to the power tools themselves that would normally not be included, such as for measuring and marking, such as drill bits, such as for clamps, and an item on sharpening and a working surface workbench, and also some safety items. First page covers measuring and marking and then starts the cutting section. That's followed by a note about Ryobi tools. I have found them to be quite effective and really very useful, and they have a warranty of 3 years. I'll go back to the previous section because I want to point something out. There's a great review of tool brands that can be found at a link here that I show on this page. It's all the different tool brands and why you should consider buying some rather than others, commercial grades, consumer grades, and professional grades. So the balance of page 2, cutting and drilling, cutting and sanding. Some of these are grouped that way only because I chose combination items. Third page continues joining and shaping, clamping, all series of clamps, a working surface workbench, and also safety equipment. The total is less than $1,200. The last page, incidentally, you're going to receive, you can see the blue links there, you're going to receive links in this document that tell you exactly where to go to get this equipment if you choose to buy it. Last page is optional power tools. They didn't make a cut, but they're very useful. I list a number of items here. So that's it, and I'll give you a link to this document. You can download it for free. I hope you find it useful, and hope to see you in the next video. Bye-bye for now.